We're talking about rewards on this program and how you might be able to help with some unsolved crime. This is Judy Gifford, and this is a home video of her now 5-year-old daughter, Kaylee. But Kaylee disappeared on her tricycle in May. She was playing in front of her home, America.
On the banks of the Erie Canal, a child goes missing.
Kaylee, if you can hear me, this is Daddy.
And we love you.
I love you, baby girl.
We want you.
Come home.
He wanted her, and he stole her.
Across town, a beloved grandmother is found brutally murdered.
No, please don't.
He did things to her that were just despicable.
Can police stop a ruthless predator before he kills again?
In a rage, did you take her pants off? Okay.
It's 1988, and just along the banks of the Erie Canal is the small, tight-knit community of Hilton, New York.
It was a really nice, quaint town that you would want to bring your family up in. Everyone knows everyone.
We've all been raised here. Our whole family has gone to Hilton schools right back to my mother 80 years ago. She went to Hilton schools. So, we're all from here. My grandmother and my grandfather bought a house in Hilton along the lake. I can certainly remember going to my grandmother's house, and it seemed like there was constant parties, and the holidays were always full. She was always either cooking or feeding or taking care of us.
Let's go. She had a lot of different recipes. You know, she used to make anything from apple pies to lemon meringue pies to chocolate pies. They were so good. I was very close with my grandmother. She was an amazing listener. We would just talk about everything. She was always there for me when I needed her.
In 1979, Viola's husband passes away. As the years go by, she is determined to spend all the time she can with her grandchildren.
My grandmother lived alone in an apartment. She enjoyed family time for sure. Got her out of the house. She didn't really like being alone in the apartment.
Over the years, Viola becomes well known in the local community as a friendly, independent, and strong-willed woman.
I would go visit her, and she'd get on the back with a motorcycle and take a ride along the lake. You don't hear a whole lot about grandmothers that are 74 years old that want to take a ride on a motorcycle. I think she liked to do it just to show that she still could do it sometimes, but always enjoyed herself.
Viola's apartment complex backs onto an abandoned railroad line that once ran through Hilton. On the morning of November 29th, 1988, the 74-year-old leaves to take her daily 2-mile walk along the trail that runs next to the tracks.
She walked where she felt that she was most at peace, where she could be herself, do her own thinking. That was part of her routine, her daily routine.
Viola's family talk to her every day, but no one has been able to reach her since the night before, and her neighbors haven't seen her all day.
Please leave your message. Mom, please call me when you get this.
My mom gave her a call, and there was no answer.
At 4:30 p.m., her granddaughter Susan heads to Viola's apartment to check on her.
My gran always wore her reading glasses, and what's in my memory is seeing that chair there with that day's newspaper and her glasses right there on the chair. I mean, she just left everything as it was. Where was she?
As the hours pass by without a word, Viola's family are increasingly worried. Then, a mile down the road, a duck hunter makes a horrific discovery.
Deputies in the area were the first ones to respond. A very secluded area along the railroad tracks. We looked out there at the crime scene and evaluated what we had.
When the sheriff's office first arrives, the only thing that I think can be concluded is that the woman was obviously beaten to death.
The body is too badly injured for police to identify the victim.
She had some defensive wounds on her arms that indicated that she had fought back or attempted to fight back. She's wearing one earring. The other earring seems to be missing. She had a jacket on, but her jacket was pulled up. Her shirt was pulled up. She was partially naked. Her pants were removed and discarded in the bushes. Given the state of the clothing, this was a possible sexual assault case. The Sheriff's Department collect a piece of a handle that appears to have been broken off a BB gun. They don't actually find the gun, but they've got this handle piece and it appears to have some blood on it. There are a number of other items that have blood on them as well. There's a railroad tie, Viola Manville's jeans, her jacket, and they collect up everything that could possibly be a piece of evidence.
With still no sign of Viola, her family called the local police.
When we called in to let the police know that she was missing, there was a report of a hunter finding a body on the railroad tracks. And he wasn't sure, they don't know if it's her yet, but I should come.
Viola's family immediately drive over to the coroner's office.
My father went in first to try to identify her. He was unable to conclusively say that was her because of the brutality of it. I was able to recognize her teeth being crisscrossed, and that was how I was able to tell it was her. If there's one thing that sticks in my mind, it's that she was not recognizable.
I was in disbelief. All of our family was in disbelief. It was just like a punch to the gut that I can't even describe. It was horrible. One of the worst days of my life. How could someone do that to someone who just minds her own business, does what she's supposed to do, loves her life, loves her family? How do you do that to someone?
Investigators hope Viola's autopsy will provide critical information about her killer.
The autopsy report reveals that Ms. Manville was shot twice with a BB gun, once just behind the ear, once near the eye. She had many injuries that were indicative of a very severe beating, and she passed away as a result of that beating.
Despite being found partially nude, the pathologist finds no evidence of sexual assault.
There was no semen to subject to DNA testing, no fingerprints on the BB gun, and the clothes weren't tested because you did not have the sophisticated ability to pull evidence from clothing, the touch-type DNA, as they call it now, that just didn't exist then.
Unable to draw anything concrete from the physical evidence, the police have no idea who the killer might be. But Viola's family do.
13 years earlier, I had asked my gram if she wanted to go to the shopping with me to the mall. I could tell that something had upset her. Something was not right. I could tell that she had been crying. And I said, Graham, I said, something's going on. What is going on? You seem sad. Why are you crying?
But Susan could never have prepared herself for what her grandmother was about to tell her.
And what she said to me, I'll never forget as long as I live. That morning, she had been on her walk. She said that there was this man, and he saw my grandmother, and he approached her, and then he attacked her. He sexually assaulted her. He did things to her, you know, that were just despicable. Before he left her, he said to her, if you ever tell anyone, I will kill you.
"74-year-old Viola Manville has been brutally murdered not far from the banks of the Erie Canal. Her body is discovered on the same trail where she'd been sexually assaulted 3 years earlier. Viola reported her assault, and the perpetrator was identified.
His name was Glenn Sterling. This man was someone that people knew in Hilton as being bad news. He had a very wild appearance. I was my grandmother. He had to do is describe his hair and the way he dressed, and immediately you knew who he was.
My grandmother was attacked by somebody I went to school with. I didn't know Glenn Sterling very well. He's quite a bit older than me. But I do know he was kind of a loner. I believe he had either a drug or alcohol problem or something that maybe provoked the incident.
The police arrest 24-year-old Glenn Sterling, who already has a criminal record, including theft and larceny.
Glenn Sterling winds up being prosecuted for sexual assault. He pleads guilty, he's convicted, and he's sent off to state prison.
But there's no way that Glenn could be the killer. He's still doing his time behind bars for assaulting Viola. Nevertheless, detectives go to the prison to interview him and see if he may have been involved.
There's probably any multitude of ways he could have done it. I mean, one of the most common would be to reach out to somebody that he knew from prison who was out now, find a way to reach out to that person and see if that person might be willing to do it for some return.
It did cross our minds that it could have been some kind of a revenge. Maybe his family was upset because he was still in prison.
The first person police dig into is Glenn's younger brother, Frank.
There were beliefs that Frank, especially because of the fact that Viola Manville had put his brother in prison, that Frank might be somebody who you'd have to look at. In September of '88, Glenn Sterling had his parole denied, so maybe this angered Frank because Glenn was not coming home for Thanksgiving.
So the initial investigation of Frank Sterling is all focused on whether or not he has an alibi. Frank Sterling was a bus monitor. He tells them he would assist getting children on and off the school bus in the morning and then again in the afternoon. And between those two times, he had his day to himself.
Frank has 4 hours between shifts that are unaccounted for. More than enough time to walk the 1 mile to where Viola was brutally beaten.
He tells them that on that particular day, he went to buy some frosting. When he comes back home to bake his cakes, there are some cartoons on. And he describes to them the plots of those cartoons. You know, he was kind of a social outcast, very much to himself.
Investigators look to corroborate Frank's alibi.
We did interview the bus drivers who dropped him off. We did go to the grocery store where Frank bought the frosting, went to Channel 21 and reviewed all the cartoons that Frank told us about.
Frank was right. In fact, those were the cartoons that were on that day. So they kind of map out all of the times that Frank Sterling would have available that day to have committed this crime. And they come up with a 20-minute period in the afternoon. Frank would have had to have been a world-class sprinter to get to all the locations he was supposed to be at and back in time to punch in for his afternoon shift for bus monitoring.
With the possibility of Frank Sterling being involved looking less and less likely, police look to rule him out using forensic evidence.
Police collect up some of his clothing from his home. They test his clothing to see if there's any potential evidence there, and they don't find anything.
With Frank ruled out of the investigation, the whole town of Hilton comes under suspicion.
They were looking at everyone. You know, we had flyers that were made for my grandmother. We would give a reward for anyone that could give information as to who did this.
The sheriff's department kind of fanned out across the town of Hilton and basically talked to any person that they thought could possibly be a suspect. They know every adult male over the age of 16 in the town of Hilton probably gets questioned a little bit by police.
The old railroad trail where the murder took place leads from the residential neighborhood where Viola lives to Hilton High School, and students often use it as a shortcut. And the use of a BB gun in the assault on Viola also leads police to believe they could be looking for a younger perpetrator.
We are asking the community of Hilton and all other areas surrounding Hilton to be particularly aware of those young people who may have owned a weapon similar to this.
Detectives head to the local high school to question students about the day of Viola's death.
People who were questioned said, you want to be sure to look at Mark Christie, because I think he's the kind of guy who would do this sort of thing.
Those who knew him found him to be somebody that was capable of violence, and he was also known to sometimes be in the area where Viola Manville was found.
Police immediately tracked down 16-year-old Mark Christie.
Mark Christie didn't like guns. He had BB guns. Everybody knew that. And obviously with a BB gun being found at the scene, that was another reason they decided to look at him. Mark Christie's asked about the BB gun, and he says,
yeah, I had a BB gun, but it broke.
It was broken, it was malfunctioning, and he had tossed it out well before the homicide.
The teenager is asked to account for his whereabouts that day.
Mark Christie told police that he was in school the day of the homicide, and he'd been seen there.
As police look into Mark Christie's alibi, the detectives catch a break. The high schooler has been talking.
There are some teenagers that come forward and say, hey, this guy told us that he killed Viola Manville. You know, multiple teenagers come forward and make this claim.
Mark Christie.
So you were the famous Mark Christie, huh?
They asked him to come down and talk to them. He was asked to take a polygraph test.
Your buddies at school said you did this.
Everybody's been talking about it in school. Most of us have. It's not just me.
Did you kill Viola Manville?
No, I didn't.
The authorities decide that he's being truthful when he said he didn't do it. And the decision was Christie was just this crazy kid that was making these claims that he killed Viola Manville because he thought somehow it'd help him make friends. It wasn't completely out of the question because, oddly enough, there were apparently several other people, teenagers, who had claimed that they'd killed Viola Manville at that time.
With the high school angle going nowhere, the investigation into Viola's murder hits a dead end, leaving the town of Hilton on edge.
It felt scary. It was difficult for the whole community. Things like that just don't happen in Hilton. I know at every tavern, at every house, every neighbor, that was what they were talking about, was my grandmother and what happened to her and what was going on.
somebody did it somewhere, and we all know that a lot of times people that do those kinds of things probably are going to do it again.
Viola Manville was found brutally beaten to death on a trail that ran behind her home. But after 2.5 years with no leads, the case has grown cold. Refusing to let the case remain unsolved, her family keep the heat on the police, leading the department to take action.
There was a new team of investigators added because of probably the pressure of my family wanting to know, what's going on.
A lot of our investigators that worked on the case were retired, and I was just retiring when they started the investigation again.
And the Sheriff's Department, I think, thinks, well, they'll bring some new blood to the investigation. 2 new investigators are assigned by the Sheriff's Office.
The new team retraces the steps of the initial investigation to see if the original detectives had missed anything. As they delve deeper, only one suspect appears to have a clear motive. Frank Sterling, the man whose brother is in prison for a vicious assault on Viola.
Their reinvestigation basically involves going out to Frank Sterling's house and seeing if they can find him. He happens to be an over-the-road trucker at that point, and coming off a 36-hour stint on the road. And they ask if he will accompany them to the Sheriff's Department. And he's compliant with them. He agrees to do that.
During the original investigation, Frank's alibi had appeared watertight, and the search of his home turned up no evidence, but they still have one thing left to try.
They take him for the interview, and he agrees to be polygraphed, and he's not hesitant to talk at all.
The detectives ask Frank to talk them through his alibi again.
On the polygraph, Frank is asked questions about the crime, about the homicide, about his whereabouts. And then they do come back with results that determines Frank is being deceptive in some of his answers.
Following the polygraph, police ramp up the pressure.
They continue to say, well, we don't think you're a bad guy. We just think that, maybe you don't remember if you did it. Frank is like, well, I can't help you. I can't remember. And the investigators say, well, you'll feel better if you just let it out. Just let it out.
Having just driven for 36 hours for his job, Frank is exhausted and seems to have trouble answering their questions.
They wind up talking to him overnight into the early hours of the morning. It winds up being 12 hours worth of questioning.
At 5:25 a.m., a video recorder is set up to film the interrogation.
Yes. Okay. You agreed to talk with us in front of the video camera and make this video? Yes. Okay, and that's strictly voluntary on your part. Okay.
To dig into Frank's motive, police ask him about his brother's conviction.
There's been some problems in the past, and it's caused anger and pain for you. Can you just describe to us what it was? And it's okay.
No, so my brother was wrongfully in prison.
Mm-hmm. They're suggesting that he had motive because of his brother who was still in prison at Thanksgiving time. His parole had been denied.
You feel Viola Manville wrongfully pointed him out as being the perpetrator who attacked her?
Yes.
You're being very sensitive and emotional. This is worked up inside you.
Yeah.
You okay?
You'll see this procedure where they are holding one of his hands, rubbing his back, kind of whispering in his ear, just let it out, you'll feel better, just let it out.
After 12 hours of interrogation, Frank finally cracks.
as best as you can, and I know it's tough for you, but as best as you can, what happened. It's okay to cry.
You're gonna have to speak up for me though, okay, Frank?
Just by chance, it was taking a rock at the same time she was down there. At that time, she reported to, told me, well, your brother got what he deserved. She said the wrong thing at the wrong time. I hit her. Hit her?
Yes.
After 2.5 years with no clear leads, the police have a confession to the murder of Viola Manville from Frank Sterling. And the motive is revenge.
In a rage, did you take her pants off?
Yes.
Okay.
Can't hear you. Yes.
In the course of the interrogation, most of the salient facts that are provided by the police officers. When left to his own devices, Frank gets all the facts wrong.
Remember what year this happened?
No.
Would you say it was approximately 2 years ago?
Yes.
Maybe 3. Somewhere between 2 and 3 years
Yes.
ago? Okay.
Well, the prosecutors and police at that point say, well, we have a confession, so we don't really need anything else.
Viola's family is informed that Frank Sterling has been arrested and charged for the crime.
It was very difficult to digest. But he savagely killed my grandmother. And anger, there's not even a word, I don't know if there's a word bigger than anger. It was just horrific, to know that someone could do something that he did, like he did to my grandmother. I wanted Frank to get the death penalty. You killed my family member, now it's your turn, you die, right?
But within 24 hours, Frank Sterling begins to recant his confession. Despite his protests, the trial goes forward and the confession is deemed admissible evidence.
He confessed. Everybody was convinced that Frank did it.
But as the trial proceeds, Viola's family begins to have doubts.
When I heard bits and pieces of what was going on at the trial, nothing seemed like a slam dunk to me. There was doubt in my mind about Frank because even though there was no other options, it just didn't fit his personality.
With questions still circling, the community tensely awaits the verdict. On September 29th, 1992, Frank Sterling is found guilty for the murder of Viola Manville. He is sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. With Sterling behind bars, the town of Hilton can finally breathe again. As months go by, normal life resumes.
It was a relief that this nightmare was finally over.
Then, 2 years after Sterling's conviction, 4-year-old Kaylee Ann Polton disappears from an apartment complex just 15 miles from Hilton.
On Monday evening, 4-year-old Kaylee was playing on her big-wheel tricycle in the front yard of her apartment. However, by 7:30 p.m., Kaylee's mom was panicking. Her daughter was gone.
Hey, Kaylee, if you can hear me, this is Daddy.
And we love you.
I love you, baby girl.
We want you.
Come home. Just a little more. I can't.
The disappearance of Kaylee Polton was another mystery that started several years later. It was a shocker to the community. A little girl disappeared.
On the evening of May 23rd, Kaylee had been playing in the front yard, her mother, Judy, preparing dinner. 5 minutes later, Judy called Kaylee to come inside, but she had vanished.
When I couldn't find her, then that scared me. Then I really got nervous and got scared, and then I went outside and started calling her.
I mean, they showed the flyers on the news, and it was the big story. Who would do this? Where is she? What's going on?
Days pass, and still no news. The investigators continue to talk with Kaylee's mother about anyone who may have motivation to harm her daughter.
We have an unfaced person out there, that took a child, and we have no idea who it is. Is it your neighbor? Investigators were asking me many questions, of course, about Kaylee. And has anybody showered your daughter with gifts? And I said, no. Or is there anybody that treats her abnormal or something? And I said, no. And then when he said, is there anybody has recently moved in or out of the complex? And I said, actually, yes, there is somebody that's just moved in here. There's a man and his girlfriend that have moved in here. They have a little boy. My daughter likes to play with the little boy.
Is that your little one there as well?
He told me he looks at all the other little girls, and by far she's the most prettiest little girl out there. That man, I said, makes me feel uncomfortable because he comments about my daughter all the time. The way he was looking at my child, at my 4-year-old daughter, was not normal at all. His name was Mark Christie.
Mark Christie, who had bragged to his teenage friends about killing Viola Manville 6 years earlier.
The same investigators now assigned to the Kaylee Polton disappearance were some of the same investigators who worked the case that led to Sterling's conviction.
They questioned Mark Christie. Mark basically says, Judy Gifford, Kaylee Polton's mother, will confirm, that I have an alibi, that I couldn't have been the person because she saw me.
Investigators examine whether Mark's story can be corroborated. They question Judy about that day.
I saw him. He was on his way to the playground. What I thought was strange about him is that he was carrying his little guy, and he had sneakers on with no laces. And I asked him if he had seen Kaylee. He said no.
No, I haven't. Sorry.
Despite Judy's recollection seeming to confirm Mark's alibi, detectives ask him to take a polygraph. He passed one during the Manville investigation. They have to find out whether he will pass once again.
Judy and Callie went home, and then I took my boy home. And I was in my apartment all day.
They determined that he is not being deceptive when he claims that he has nothing to do with Kaylee Polton's disappearance.
They had interrogated him, they had polygraphed him, they had searched his home, they went through the rule book, they did everything right, and they still had nothing.
With no conclusive evidence, police moved their attention away from Mark Christie. Time passes, and a year later, the case seems to be stalling.
The trail kind of goes cold, and there's a 2-year, pretty much nationwide manhunt at that point to attempt to locate the person involved in Kaylee Polton's disappearance.
Judy's friends and neighbors from East Rochester, New York, have helped her to raise over $100,000 in reward money, and we're asking anybody who knows anything to please call, because this could be your child.
I was willing to talk to anybody and go anywhere and do anything to put Kaylee's face out there so people knew who she was and that she was missing.
As the nationwide search continues, police receive a stunning new lead.
In 1996, police get a call from a woman who tells them, look, I just had this fight with my husband, and during that argument that he made a comment claiming that he killed Kaylee Ann Polton. That person turned out to be Mark Christie.
Tragic news tonight as Rochester's missing little girl is about to be recovered.
Police say the body of Kaylee Ann Polton is right here in Rochester, and a local man is charged with her murder.
Backed into a corner by his wife's testimony, Mark confesses to the murder of Kaylee Polton.
After he abducts Kaylee and he has her in his apartment, he hears Judy Gifford calling out for her daughter. She can't find her, and he panics at that point and strangles Kaylee. The next day, Mark Christie took Kaylee Polton's body out of the apartment complex, past the police roadblock to his place of employment where there were large water tanks, weighted it down, and concealed it in a water tank.
That's where she was until he confessed and her body was retrieved. He didn't strangle her with his hands at all. He strangled her with a ligature. So that is with the laces that I saw on his sneakers tied around Kaylee's neck in the end. I think his plan was to molest her, assault her. I think he did something to her. He wanted her. He stole her. The investigators tried to ask him that question, whether he actually ever, assaulted Kaylee. And he said, "I never touched her," was his response. Because her body was so decomposed, they couldn't really prove anything. So we'll never know that answer.
She's come back to us, but not the way that we had hoped. So therefore, now we have another plight ahead of us. We have to bury our child. We owe her at least that.
On October 15th, 1997, Mark Christie pleads guilty to Kaylee Polton's murder. He is sentenced to 25 years to life. With Christie guilty, the community wonder if maybe he's killed before.
Everybody remembered who Mark Christie was because he was a part of the investigation. He was a Hilton resident. Obviously, the first thing you got to say to yourself is he the one that really killed my grandmother?
Mark Christie has been convicted for the murder of 4-year-old Kaylee Ann Polton. Attorney Donald Thompson believes Mark Christie murdered Viola Manville, and the wrong man is in prison. He files a motion to challenge the conviction of Frank Sterling, having questioned the validity of the original confession.
As time is passing, DNA technology is improving. There would likely be DNA that would be testable at the Viola Manville crime scene. It's called touch DNA, where if you grab someone or something, like Ms. Manville's jeans that had been removed, for example, or her jacket, there could be sufficient DNA at that point to confirm or deny who was involved in her murder.
A detective speaks with Mark Christie, and due to advances in science, they are able to get a full DNA sample. The results that come back send shockwaves across the community.
The DNA profile that's developed from the top of Viola Manville's jeans, the cuffs of Viola Manville's jeans, and the portion of Viola Manville's jacket absolutely excluded Frank Sterling, and is sufficient to include Mark Christie. It's a match.
Mark Christie's lies have finally caught up with him.
You got me. Investigator, he's able to get Mark Christie to confess to the murder of Viola Manville.
That day, Ms. Manville is out walking on the railroad tracks. Mark Christie encounters Viola Manville. And without any particular reason, beats her savagely.
Mark said he had hit her so hard that her earring had been embedded in this piece of wood, this shard of railroad tie that he'd killed her with.
They go back and they look at the end of the railroad tie, and embedded in the end of the railroad tie is the backer to Viola Manville's other earring. That, together with Mark Christie's confession and his DNA sample, basically seals the deal. After that, he leaves her to die.
There was no motivation. There was no reason. It was just he wanted to kill her. That's why he did what he did. Sick individual.
from WROC, this is News 8 at 6.
Good evening. He is already serving time for killing a little girl. Today, he learned his fate in another murder.
Christie will spend 20 years to life behind bars for killing 74-year-old Viola Manville in 1988.
And after being wrongfully imprisoned for almost 18 years, Frank Sterling's conviction is overturned.
Is hereby ordered to be released from the custody of the Department of Corrections.
I made it. Patience is a virtue.
Sterling filed a wrongful conviction lawsuit, and in May 2014, Monroe County agreed to settle the case for $8.6 million.
There's many lessons from this case. One, people falsely confess like Frank Sterling did. Two, people beat polygraphs like Mark Christie did. And three, the courts should be open to the possibility that they got it wrong. And prosecutors and police should be open to the possibility they got it wrong, instead of deciding that we need the case to go away, because when that happens, sometimes you end up with the wrong person in prison for 20 years.
After so much tragedy, all the two families have left is their love for those lost.
The last time I saw my grandmother was on Thanksgiving. We had a great day. It was a great Thanksgiving. You know, we always tried to do is we always made sure that we hugged and, you know, said, I love you. You know, we'll see ya soon. And that was just the kind of thing we did, you know, with her, to make sure she knew how much we did love her.
There she is. It's kind of like one of the last things I have of her alive is that, pretty much. She was like basically my whole life, and she was mine. We were each other's, and I think she knew that.